Hello everyone, and welcome to another video. Today we are going to continue talking about the legislative branch of the government, but we are going to be talking more specifically about the implied and non-legislative powers. Talking about the legislative branch of the government, the big thing is passing laws. Well, the powers that we're going to talk about in this video are ones that aren't necessarily related to passing laws, and these are the ones that are implied. Now, what does it mean to have an implied power? Whenever something is implied, that means that while you may not say it directly out loud or explicitly say it verbatim, that's what you mean. For instance, like let's say that we were in class and I said, I got up in front of the class and I said, alright guys, we're going to be taking a test. The test is going to be coming out in 5 minutes, so everybody needs to get ready to take a test. I'm not telling you to get out a pencil. I'm not telling you to, quickly look over your notes. You've got 5 minutes to review. I'm implying that. So, that's what it means to imply something, to suggest it without saying it directly. The necessary and proper clause. What does the Constitution have to say about education? Nothing. Not a word. Still, Congress provides tens of billions of dollars every year for the United States Department of Education to spend in a variety of ways throughout the country. Look around you. What indicators of these federal dollars can you find in your local school? If you attend a public school anywhere in the United States, that evidence should not be hard to spot. Everything, just about everything, that a school provides to you is funded through the government, and a lot of that funding can be traced back to this necessary and proper clause. It doesn't necessarily say in the Constitution that the legislative branch of the government should provide funding for public education, but it is implied. Lunchtime at the Ann Richards School for Young Women Leaders in Austin, Texas. Through its implied powers, Congress has provided funding for school lunch programs. How can this be? Congress has only those powers delegated to it by the Constitution, and that document says nothing about education. The answer to that question lies in the implied powers of Congress. Implied powers are those powers that are not set out in so many words from the Constitution, but are rather implied and drawn from those that are. The constitutional basis for the existence of the implied powers is found in one of the expressed powers. The necessary and proper clause is the final clause in the lengthy Section 8 of Article 1 in the Constitution, and gives to Congress the express power, quote, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or in any department or officer thereof. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. This is sometimes known as the elastic clause. Much of the vitality and adaptability of the Constitution can be traced directly to this provision, and even more so to the ways in which both Congress and the Supreme Court have interpreted and applied it over the years. In effect, the necessary and proper clause allows Congress to choose the means for carrying into execution the many powers given to it by the Constitution. The manner in which Congress has viewed the concept, together with the supporting decisions of the Supreme Court, have made the final clause in Article 1, Section 8 truly the elastic clause. It has earned that name, for it has been stretched so far and made to cover so much over the years. Now, the Founding Fathers were some pretty smart people, and they realized that there were going to be some situations that the government were going to encounter that they had no way of foreseeing or knowing about, that they wanted the government to be able to respond to those situations. So that is where this necessary and proper clause comes in. They use the necessary and proper clause to say, well, in order to carry out our functions, we have to be able to do this. And because that's been stretched and stretched and stretched over the years to respond to growing situations. That's why it's called the elastic clause, because it stretches like elastic. Now, things that they've had to stretch for, like it said earlier, was funding for public education. Do you think back in 1787, when the Constitution was written, the Founding Fathers could foresee the government having to respond to cyber terrorism? A global economy? No, there's no way they'd be able to even fathom those sorts of things. So of course, this elastic clause has been stretched to fit the necessary functions of the modern day. Okay, here are some more express powers and implied powers. The express power to lay and collect taxes. That implies the power to punish tax evaders, regulate some commodities and outlaw the use of others, and set conditions to qualify for federal funding. The express power to borrow money implies the power to establish the Federal Reserve System of banks. The express power to create naturalization law implies the power to regulate and limit immigration, and so on and so forth. There have been a lot of things that the Congress has done that aren't necessarily stated word for word in the Constitution, because if they could only do the things that were explicitly stated in the Constitution would have to be enormously huge to have every single thing laid out word for word of what they can and can't do. So, by making this necessary and proper clause, the Founding Fathers gave future legislators the ability to stretch it to what they need it to do. Okay, strict versus liberal construction. The Constitution had barely come into force when the meaning of the elastic clause became the subject of one of the most important disputes in American political history. The framers of the Constitution intended to create a new and stronger national government. The ratification of their plan was opposed by many, and that opposition was not stilled by the adoption of the Constitution. Rather, the conflict between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists continued into the early years of the Republic. Much of that conflict centered on the powers of Congress and the meaning of the elastic clause. Just how broad, in fact, were those powers? The strict constructionists, led by Thomas Jefferson, continued to argue the anti-Federalist position from the ratification period. They insisted that Congress should be able to exercise its express powers, and only those implied powers absolutely necessary to carry out those express powers. They maintained that the states should keep as much power as possible. They agreed with Jefferson that government is best which governs least. That is a phrase that Thomas Jefferson has very famously used. Thomas Jefferson wanted a small government. Thomas Jefferson was one of these people who, back during the American Revolution, had just fought to get out from under a king and did not want to establish a new government that could be just as oppressive. So that's what it means. That government is best which governs least, meaning a smaller government is better. Most of these Jeffersonians did acknowledge a need to protect interstate trade, and they recognized the need for a strong national defense. At the same time, they feared the consequences of a strong national government. They believed, for instance, that the interests of the people of Connecticut were not the same as those of South Carolinians or Marylanders or Pennsylvanians. They argued that only the states, not the far-off national government, could protect and preserve those differing interests. The liberal constructionists, led by Alexander Hamilton, had led the fight to adopt the Constitution. Now, they favored a liberal interpretation of that document, a broad construction of the powers it gives to Congress. They believed that the country needed, as Hamilton put it in the Federalist No. 70, an energetic government. So, Alexander Hamilton differed from Thomas Jefferson in that he thought that the federal government should be a bigger government, that it should be a stronger government, and he favored expanding government power. So of the two, Alexander Hamilton is really going to like this necessary and proper clause. Liberal construction prevails. The Supreme Court upheld the concept of implied powers in McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819. At the time, a Maryland law required all banks not chartered by the state to print their currency on special paper stamped by the state, which amounted to a tax. James McCulloch, the cashier of the Baltimore branch of the Second Bank of the United States, refused to use the paper, claiming that states could not tax the federal government. The court declared the Maryland law unconstitutional. That victory for the liberal constructionists set a pattern that, in general, has been followed ever since. Over the years, the powers wielded by the national government have grown to a point that even the most ardent supporters of the liberal construction could not have imagined. It is impossible to see how the United States could have developed as it has over the past 2 centuries had the court not ruled as it did in McCulloch. Our government functions a lot based on precedent. A lot of decisions are made based on a precedent that is set in a previous lawsuit. For example, right here, McCulloch versus Maryland, whenever people are against the concept of implied powers, the government can refer back to McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819 and said, well, the Supreme Court ruled that these implied powers are constitutional. So that is why this lawsuit was such a big deal. It set the precedent for implied powers. Several factors working together with the liberal construction of the Constitution have been responsible for that marked growth in national power. They have included wars, economic crises, and other national emergencies. Spectacular advances, especially in transportation and communication, have also had a real impact on the size and the scope of government. Equally important have been the demands of the people for more and still more services from government. Broad interpretations of power. Congress has been led by these and other factors to view its powers in broader and broader terms. Most presidents have regarded their powers in like fashion. The Supreme Court has generally taken a similar position in its decisions in cases involving the powers of the national government. Moreover, the American people have generally agreed with a broader rather than a narrow reading of the Constitution. This consensus or general agreement has prevailed even though our political history has been marked, and still is, by controversies over the proper limits of national power. There are always going to be people in office that want to expand their authority, expand their power. So that is just going to be something that has been seen throughout history and will continue to be seen. Okay, here is a graphic that gives you a little bit more information about strict constructionists versus liberal constructionists. I'm not going to read all of that to you. If you want to pause the video and take a look, you're more than welcome to do so. The doctrine in practice. The ways in which the necessary and proper clause have been construed and applied over the last 200 years has enabled the national government to meet the changing needs of the times. As a result, it has virtually eliminated the need for frequent amendment of the Constitution. If this necessary and proper clause, this elastic clause, had never been put in, every single time the government faced a new problem that they didn't have the authority to deal with, they would have had to have amended the Constitution. So this necessary and proper clause has been very vital for the Constitution to have been written back in the 1800s and still be applicable today. The 2009 government bailout and subsequent takeover of failing automotive companies Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors was an example of the exercise of the doctrine of implied powers. The Commerce Clause. Commerce has been defined so broadly that it encompasses virtually every form of economic activity today. Congress has the authority to regulate manufacturing, wages, and hours, labor management relations, foods and drugs, air travel, and much more. It can provide for the building of interstate highways, consumer protection, the protection of the environment, the list goes on and on. Recently, many had assumed that if the Supreme Court were to uphold the individual mandate provision of the Affordable Care Act, a health care reform measure promoted by President Barack Obama and Democrats in Congress in 2012, it would once again be on the grounds of commerce. This provision stated that every American citizen must have health insurance or else be required to pay a fine. To the surprise of many, however, the court upheld the law by linking it to a different enumerated power, the power to lay and collect taxes. Now, there are limits on the commerce power. Still, Congress is not free to use the Commerce Clause to do whatever it chooses. The Constitution places 4 explicit limitations on the exercise of the commerce power, and the Supreme Court does, at least on occasion, find that the lawmaking branch has overstepped its authority under that provision. Congress cannot pass a law based solely on the grounds that a measure will somehow promote the general welfare of the United States, but it can and does levy taxes and provide for the spending of money for that purpose. Thus, for example, as discussed earlier, Congress assigns to a particular use tens of billions of dollars per year to support education, and similarly, it does so to provide for such things as farm subsidies, unemployment compensation, Social Security, Medicare, and a host of other programs. The war powers. The several war powers reflect the fact that the national government is responsible for the protection of this country against aggression and, when necessary, for the waging of war. As with its other express powers, Congress has the authority to do whatever is necessary and proper for the execution of its war power, with the exception that, in doing so, it cannot violate any other provision of the Constitution. Among many other examples of the point, Congress has the power to provide for compulsory military service, a draft, because Article 1, Section 8 gives it the express power to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy. The Supreme Court originally upheld the constitutionality of a draft in a series of cases challenging the Selective Service Act of 1917. Okay guys, that's going to be it for this video. I know it went a little long, I apologize for that. If you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of me. I hope everybody's having a great day, and I'll see you again real soon. Bye.